Welcome back. Now for our big exclusive on Global Lens. As the global spotlight turns to India with the G20 Summit just days away and top world leaders set to descend on capital New Delhi, India's G20 Chief Coordinator, Ambassador Harsh Vardhan Shringla, spoke exclusively to me about the massive preparations that are underway for the mega global summit. In this wide-ranging conversation, Ambassador Shringla, who's also served as India's Foreign Secretary, talked about how India's G20 presidency is unique, unprecedented, unlike any other, and being executed in line with Prime Minister Narendra Modi's vision. He says India's approach is human-centric globalization and the entire focus is on the needs of and challenges faced by the developing world, with Prime Minister Modi repeatedly asserting that India is the voice of the global south. Echoing the words of the G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant, who was on this show earlier this week, Ambassador Shringla says India's presidency is indeed a people's presidency, with the country taking it to the grassroots level to all states, cities, towns and even municipalities, making every citizen a stakeholder, especially the youth, and in the process providing a shining example of democratization of G20 and ultimate cooperative federalism. Interestingly, Ambassador Shringla described the G20 presidency as a discovery of India for all the foreign delegates visiting the country. In the end, borrowing Prime Minister Modi's words, Ambassador Shringla said India's G20 legacy will be one of a Vishwamitra or a friend of the world. Here's that exclusive interview. Hello and welcome. You're watching News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. And I am joined with a special guest today. We have with us Ambassador Harsh Vardhan Shringla. He is the Chief Coordinator for India's G20 Presidency. He has also served as India's Foreign Secretary. Ambassador Shringla, welcome to News9.
Thank you very much for having me on your show, Neha.
It's an absolute pleasure, sir, and we're deeply grateful that you made the time, because this is obviously a very, very busy time for you. So let me begin by asking you this. All eyes are going to be on India with the G20 Summit now just around the corner. It is one of the biggest events on the global diplomatic calendar. And you are the Chief Coordinator, the man who's putting it all together, with the global spotlight on India. So I'd like to ask you, what would you say, as the man who's at the center of it all, what goes into preparing for such a mega global event? Because the stakes couldn't be higher. What are the challenges like, and have there been a lot of sleepless nights?
Well, you're right. I mean, in about 2 weeks from now, India will be hosting its most significant international event since independence. And you'll have 40 leaders of the G20 countries and international organizations coming to New Delhi for that summit. This is a culmination, as you said, of some 200 meetings that have preceded the summit. Those meetings, which are mainly sectoral in nature, health, environment, trade, etc., prepare the ground for the discussions and ultimate outcomes at the summit. But from a preparatory point of view, I think, we have started quite a long time back. I remember even as early as 2020, when I was Foreign Secretary, we had a number of meetings to discuss preparations for the G20 presidency when we would take over. And the G20 Secretariat was set up a good 6 to 8 months before we assumed our presidency on the 1st of December last year. The process, of course, has received a lot of high-level support and facilitation. The Prime Minister himself has provided guidance. You saw that he released the logo and the theme of India's G20 presidency before we took over our presidency. He also addressed all governors and chief ministers on our presidency's, I would say, expectations and ambitions, and also, sought the cooperation of states and union territories in hosting a successful G20 presidency. And that laid the ground for our work with all of our partners and stakeholders in arranging G20 meetings across the length and breadth of our country. And I think from that point of view, in terms of planning, preparation, we have been well ahead of the curve. And as we near the most important event in our G20 calendar, I think every Indian can feel proud of the fact that we will have, in many senses, one of the most unique and unprecedented presidencies of this very important organization, which consists of the most important developed and emerging economies of the world. So India today, I think, is in many senses ready to host an event which few countries have the opportunity to really do in the manner that we have done and will be doing.
You're quite right in pointing out, sir, that every Indian can feel proud of this and does feel proud of this, I can tell you. In fact, just yesterday we had a mega success with Chandrayaan 3 successfully landing on the moon. And now we're all looking forward to the G20 Summit when world leaders are going to descend on India's capital. Now, this is a process that has gone on for a very long time. And it's an opportunity, but at the same time, there are plenty of challenges. As I said, the global spotlight will be on India. Prime Minister Modi's vision is driving this entire event. The stakes, like I said, could not be higher. Therefore, I will ask you this. What are the pressures like when you are, in the thick of things? What is the pressure like?
Well, as I said, it's been a process with some 200 meetings, being hosted in different parts of our country. There has been a lot of effort to ensure that, our representation of all of these meetings is on lines that are in keeping with the Prime Minister's vision and expectations, and of course the leadership in whichever way you have envisioned that the G20 should be held. So I think from that point of view, in any such organization, particularly one in which there is no precedence, we have never been president of the G20 before. This is the first time we will take on the presidency. So there's no copybook that we can follow. And from that point of view, we've had to, start the process almost from scratch. And of course, we have taken the advice and guidance of previous presidencies, especially Indonesia and Italy, that have been very forthcoming. But at the same time, because it is in many senses a uniquely Indian presidency, we wanted to make sure that it was different. And those do add to your organizational pressures when you plan meetings across the length and breadth of the country. Basic objective being to democratize the G20, take it down to the grassroots levels, make sure that every citizen of our country is a stakeholder in the G20 process. And I think that exercise has been undertaken through what we call a Jan Bhagidari process, making sure that it goes down to every part of our country through, involving universities, schools, festivals, quiz competitions. I think today the G20 logo and theme are, ubiquitous across our country. You can see it everywhere. Every citizen is proud to be associated with that. And that is, I think, the success of the G20 in a country like ours, where in the past, such events were an exercise held in the capital, a remote exercise in the capital. Today, whether it is from Kashmir to Kumarakom in Kerala, or from Kutch in Gujarat to Kohima in Nagaland, we've taken the G20 to every small, town and city in our country. And that, I think, has brought people into the fold of the G20 exercise. And I think that is what has made it a very, very unique effort.
I couldn't agree more with you. And, I want to dwell a little bit on this point that you made about how this is a unique presidency, India's G20 presidency. Of course, the theme is One Earth, One Family, One Future. And the Prime Minister's vision has been to take it to the people, to, in a sense, strip this process of the elitism that it's so far been associated with. Like you said, it's been taken all over the country to tier 2, tier 3 cities. It's been turned into a people's movement in many ways. And the Prime Minister has also made it abundantly clear that the focus has to be on development and growth. Do you believe the G20 summit that's going to take place in New Delhi on the 9th and the 10th will truly reflect this vision that's been laid out by the Prime Minister? And, In what ways do you think India's G20 presidency has been truly unique and different from that of every other country in the past?
So, our ancient philosophy speaks to us about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. And loosely translated, it is also the theme of our presidency. One earth, one family, one future.
Yes.
And it is this philosophy, I think, that has guided our approach, not only the G20, but even earlier when we conduct foreign policy. Our approach is human-centric globalization. How can India contribute to the larger global common good? How can we as a country that today is the fastest growing large economy in the world, a country that has just successfully landed its spacecraft on the moon, a country that is at the leading edges of digital public infrastructure and digital transformations, one of the countries that is most successful in meeting its own goals in terms of climate change and climate energy transitions. We have, in many senses, created the example of a successful and inclusive development model that we can share with the rest of the world. And that is what Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is all about. The world is one family, and we approach the future together as a family. And unless we do that, obviously the world is not going to be the safest place or the best place. We need to work together, and we need to put our shoulders to the effort so that ultimately the outcome takes along all with it. So as you grow and prosper, you also have to make sure that countries and people who are not as successful in their economic growth is also carried along. So our message to the G20 is, let us use the combined and representational, I would say, entity that the G20 consists of to help the rest of the world, especially the developing world, the global south. And it's in that regard, I think, that we have oriented our presidency. Our broad priorities reflect the priorities not only of our G20 partners, but also of the global south. Whether you talk about the sustainable development goals and keeping the momentum going in that regard, whether you talk about digital public infrastructure and digital transformations, whether you speak of strengthening multilateral development banks, or women-led development, which India has, I think, pushed within the G20. All of these are priorities of the developing countries. And the outcomes that we would like to see from this will also reflect areas that the developing world can identify with and feel that India, as the president of the G20, has really kept in mind our priorities and our interests at a time when the global situation is so fluid. We've had the devastating COVID-19 pandemic. You still have the ongoing Ukraine conflict. The impact is felt across the world, but especially in the developing world. How can they be benefited from the G20's, I would say, larger efforts to provide for macroeconomic stability and financial growth? So this, I think, is an important issue. And our philosophy encompasses moving forward through our G20 partners in a way that can assist and help the rest of the world. So the world looks to India today in a difficult time for providing or contributing to solutions to global challenges. And India has risen up to the occasion. And I think today we can safely say that not only in terms of our foreign policy during COVID times, making sure that medicines reached 190 countries.
Diplomacy.
Vaccine Maitri, which reached so many developing countries across the world, our neighbors. And today, through a process, through the G20 presidency process, how can we really help the world, which is not in the best shape as it stands?
I'm glad, sir, that you talk about the developing world and the global south. I want to dwell a little bit further on that. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has repeatedly said that India is going to be the voice of the global south. He's even said this at the ongoing BRICS Summit in Johannesburg. And it seems this has been the primary focus and the leitmotif of India's G20 presidency. Do you believe, sir, that given the push that India has made in terms of the shift in the agenda from G20 summits of the past, do you believe this particular G20 summit, when the New Delhi declaration comes out, is going to prove to be a watershed moment for the developing world, because what we've seen more often than not is the developed world, the G7 nations, in a sense, hijacking the agenda. India's focus is to bring the focus back entirely to issues of the developing world. Do you believe this is going to be a watershed moment?
I think we have already, laid the ground for a G20 process that would look into the interests not just of the G20 countries, but beyond the G20 into the larger global community, especially in the global south. And in that context, I don't think there is any divergence within the G20. I think all of our partners in the G20 are happy to use the G20's experience, expertise, and strengths to assist and provide a framework, a normative framework that can assist the developing world. Take digital transformations, for example. I mean, we have shown through our own example within India how we can use digital platforms to empower people, to ensure that benefits go directly to the lowest socioeconomic strata of society without any, in many senses, without any middlemen, without any corruption in that process. It's a process that empowers people. And how can we take that model? I mean, the Prime Minister pointed out that there are 3 billion people in the world without identity cards. There are 1 billion people without bank accounts. How can we take our Jan Dhan Aadhaar example, for example, or other such examples in the developing, within the G20, and help countries in that process of securing a digitized identity for their citizens, for securing the access to bank accounts for them, and ultimately ensuring that the gains of development go down to the people who should get it. And I think that is an endeavor which is on the way, and I think the G20 is very, very happy to take those initiatives forward. So we have come up with a record number of new initiatives, initiatives that are designed to help the developing world, and I'm sure most of those initiatives will find their way into the ultimate outcomes. And as I said, I mean, I think our partners are quite happy to work with us in that endeavor.
You talk about digitalization. Not only has it been one of the biggest accomplishments of this country in recent years, it's in a way a model that India has set for many other countries around the world. But then, so as you pointed out, the world is going through a crisis at multiple levels right now. These are difficult times, especially in wake of the Russia-Ukraine war. You have a food crisis around the world. You have an energy crisis. There are supply chain disruptions. Do you believe that India can leverage the G20 platform and its G20 presidency to not only bring the focus on these issues, but to actually take the world or steer the world towards a more sustainable development and growth?
Well, as I mentioned, I think the concerns of the developing world are those that we try to articulate in under our own presidency. And we have started the exercise early. I mean, even before we took the presidency of the G20, we had the Voice of Global South Summit, which the Prime Minister himself led. It was attended by 125 developing countries, including many heads of state and government of the developing world. And we sought their views, their sense of expectation from our G20 presidency. And so we had fed in that process into our presidency well before we even started. So in a certain sense, our presidency has been geared to cater to, as I said, not only the interests of the G20 members themselves, which is obviously there, but also to the rest of the international community, especially the developing world. So from that perspective, I think if you see many of the efforts that we are making, how do we sustain the SDG process, which is in the midway mark, but is floundering due to some of the global events that I mentioned, COVID, Ukraine conflict, etc. The G20 foreign ministers endorsed a 7-year SDG plan. The next 7 years, how can we accelerate this process? How can you ensure that, for example, countries that are indebted countries that need climate financing get support from the multilateral development banks? How can you enhance the mandates of these banks? How can you ensure that there is more resources that are available to them to fulfill the expectations of the 21st century? How can you ensure that climate transitions are a smooth process? Can G20, especially the developed countries, agree to $100 billion a year budget that would go into helping these countries in their energy transitions and their climate transitions? These are issues that are part of our presidency exercise. And I think all of these issues will impact on the main concerns and areas of expectation of the Global South.
Now, G20 is primarily an economic forum, but unfortunately in recent years we've seen it being almost hijacked by geopolitics. Do you believe that India is in a position to bring the focus back to economy, growth and development, and are countries on board as far as that is concerned? The member states, I mean.
Well, the G20 has a primary, I think, mandate to look into socio-economic and financial issues. But it doesn't confine them to those areas. I mean, after all, the Prime Minister, in one of his interventions in the G20 during the COVID period, called for a human-centric globalization. And he said this is the first time the G20 has met on a humanitarian issue under the Saudi presidency. And that, I think, reflected the approach that, wherever there is a requirement, the G20 can look into those, whether it's humanitarian, it's disaster relief, cybersecurity. These are areas that are also important beyond purely financial and socioeconomic issues. But certainly, the fact is that the focus should be on the issues that deserve the most attention. And it's our view that today, given the problems of the day at the global level, the G20 should really be looking at solutions to those problems that emanate from increasing prices of the imports of fuel, food, fertilizers, high rates of high inflation, lowering demand for demand for items that developing countries produce. Remittances have been affected. So in many senses, economies, for example, smaller countries that depend on one sector of the economy, for example, tourism, are badly hit. So what can we do to alleviate those situations? What can the G20 do to step up to that plate? And I think it is incumbent on the G20 as the paramount grouping of the most developed and largest emerging economies of the world to come up with solutions that the world expects of them. And this is what we are saying, that these socioeconomic issues are critical, and these are the issues that really we should be focusing on because this is what the world expects of us.
Absolutely. And Prime Minister Modi's advocacy of full membership of the African Union, for example, of G20, I think is testament to his commitment to that development and growth agenda. So the G20 is also a great platform for promoting trade and cultural ties. Like we discussed earlier, we've taken this to multiple cities across India, tier 2, tier 3 cities, even a grand event that was held in Kashmir, which was a great cultural extravaganza, was very well received. Therefore, to what extent do you think the G20 has given us an opportunity to showcase our soft power to the world?
Well, a few days ago, in his Independence Day address, the Prime Minister spoke of the Triveni of demography, democracy, and diversity. And I think it is very, very well exemplified in the way that we've conducted our G20 presidency. When you talk about demography, we're a country which has the highest productive workforce in the world. The youth of our country are our future, and they're the ones who will take us through the Amrit Kal to the 100th anniversary of our independence, where we have an ambition to become a developed country, a Viksit Bharat. And from that point of view, I think the youth is a high priority in terms of how we project and portray our country. And if you see the involvement of the youth in the G20, it's been extraordinary. The Youth 20, the Y20 itself has held some 64,000 events involving 26 lakh students from university and schools. So you can imagine how many people across the country have been involved in Y20. They've held some 13,000 professional events involving professionals. I mean, they've involved 13,000 professionals, excuse me. So from a certain point of view, the involvement of youth and younger people across the board has been extraordinary. And in every place that we have gone to, every part of the country where G20 events have been held, there have been side events, there have been exhibitions, there have been opportunities for the young people to be part of that. So demography is one aspect of it. Diversity is very critical because, we talk about, Prime Minister's talked about the fact that Harek Rajya ki Vibhinta, Virasat, Sundarta, that is, every state has its own, uniqueness, which should be highlighted. And I think that is what diversity represents. The best of our cultural heritage and diversity is on display. And every part of the country that people have been to, they have visited places that are historic and cultural importance. They have partaken in our cuisine, including millets, and they have seen cultural performances that have been unique to that part of our country. And so our cultural heritage and diversity has been on full display, as has been the tourism potential of some of the most beautiful parts of our country.
Including Kashmir,
including Kashmir, including Kutch, including Darjeeling and West Bengal, my own hometown. Every part of the country has been there. The northeast, for example, the south, Kumarakom I mentioned. So essentially, it has been an exercise of a discovery of India for the thousands, tens of thousands of foreign visitors who have come to India to attend meetings and to be part of that effort. And of course, democracy. I mean, we are the mother of democracy. We are not only the largest democracy, we are, our roots of democracy grew to ancient times, and democracy has been part of our fabric from history. And as we come down here, I think the fact that we have taken the G20 across our country, the fact that through the Jan Bhagidari process, we have involved people at the grassroots level in our G20 presidency exercise, is the best example of a democratization of the G20. And as Sherpa Amitabh Kant told you, it is a people's G20 in many senses. So we have really, I think, in many senses achieved those objectives that were envisaged. The vision of the Prime Minister, I think, has already in many senses been accomplished in the 9 months of G20, that G20 presidency in our country. And I think the culmination of these efforts will be seen in the summit in New Delhi in a couple of weeks' time. So I think we have to look out for that space.
We are all looking forward to it with a lot of pride and excitement. And you put it quite eloquently. It's been a discovery of India for many. And I would say it's been a beautiful showcase of our cultural heritage. For a moment, sir, I want to just step back and look at the big picture. What do you think India being the host of the G20 Summit mean for India's own stature? There is no doubt that its stature has risen significantly in recent years. But what do you think India now being the G20 host really means for its position on the global stage?
Well, yesterday I heard the Prime Minister when he commented on the successful landing. He said the moon mission is not just India's success, it is the success of all of humanity.
Correct.
And I think we look at our G20 presidency also as being one for the good of all humanity, for the global common good. So human-centric globalization has been, as I said, the most important orientation of our G20 presidency, and will be the legacy that we leave behind as it goes to other developing countries, to Brazil, to South Africa. I think the concept that the G20 will put its efforts to assisting the rest of the world in meeting the challenges that can be addressed globally, I think is going to be one that will stay with the G20. And I think one that we can be proud of. We are talking about the fact that that we have led by example, that we have showcased our own ability to cater to a population of 1.4 billion people. And I think the transformations across the board in our country have made the world sit up and realize that here is a country which is on the move, and a country that is in a position to provide leadership from the front to global efforts. I mean, not just developmental efforts, not just efforts that encourage economic and social growth, but also in terms of vision, in terms of narrative, in terms of the way you can provide a sort of, I would say, message to the rest of the world on how you could move forward in the years to come. And so I think our legacy is one of a Vishwamitra, a friend of the world, and one that I think will be, that is how we will be remembered under the leadership of the Prime Minister.
Yes.
And in that moment that we undertake, we go up to leading the summit of world leaders, G20. I think India and the Prime Minister and the rest of our country will be remembered as a Vishwamitra.
That's wonderful. Finally, sir, on that very question of legacy, I want to ask you, as the man who is working hard day and night and has such an important role in ensuring the success of this summit, which means a lot to all of us as Indians, what, according to you, will be truly India's G20 legacy? I know you just said Vishwamitra. How would you want the world to perceive India's G20 presidency, and what would be most personally satisfying for you as the man who's been at the center of it all?
Well, from our perspective, I think those who have worked for the G20 presidency and have been involved in this exercise have seen that it's a whole of government approach led by the Prime Minister himself.
Yes.
So every department, ministry and agency of the government where relevant has been involved in this exercise.
Yes.
And I think with the help of states, union territories and a decentralized level, districts, municipalities, right down to the grassroots levels, it has been the best example of cooperative federalism.
Yes.
I mean, we have worked seamlessly, and states, whether it is states from any part of our country, I think have all put their effort wholly and fully behind the G20 effort.
Yes.
So I think, union territory said like Jammu and Kashmir, a state like Rajasthan, or a state like West Bengal, a state like Gujarat, Maharashtra, every state has really put its best foot forward. Every state has seen the G20 as an opportunity for India, but also for that particular state to represent its best interests.
Yeah.
So cooperative federalism is in full flow. And I think that is one of the things that, from my perspective, I think I've been in a very, very unique position to witness. And I would say I've been very fortunate to see that in action. We have been part of history in many senses.
Absolutely.
A small part of a historic process. Yeah. And in a certain sense, I think this is something that would go down in the annals of history as an extraordinary phase in India's global leadership process.
I couldn't agree more, and I will say you're not playing a small, making the Prime Minister's vision come true. This is an event that all of us are looking forward to, that we're all very proud of. Here's hoping that the People's Presidency goes from strength to strength, and wish you all the very best, sir, with the mega event. I have no doubt in my mind it'll be a grand success that we'll all be proud of. Thank you so much, Ambassador Shringla, for your time.
Thank you very much, Neha.
Thank you, sir.